Hello, I'm Ian Bateman. I'm Professor of Environmental Economics and Director of the Land, Environment, Economics and Policy Institute here at the University of Exeter. In this video we're going to talk about how our understanding of ecosystem services can be brought together with our understanding of the economy and the extent to which we can actually value ecosystem services in ways which economic decision makers can understand. So, can we make decisions about the environment without values? Well, there's two inescapable facts that we have to consider here. First of all, we don't have infinite resources. We only have this one world and it's not getting any bigger. And second, that means that if we decide to do one thing, then we must, in effect, be deciding not to do another. Which means we're making values, we're making decisions about those limited resources and we're conveying our values through those decisions. So it's impossible to make decisions without values. The choice is whether you make those values explicitly by saying, I think these are the values of things, or just implicitly. You just make decisions and the values come out as a result of those decisions. Now, what economists argue is that you should be explicit about the values that you use. You shouldn't just keep these values hidden as a result of your decisions. But why measure these values in terms of money? Well, another unavoidable fact about the environment is that it's all connected. So we have sets of natural capital delivering lots of different ecosystem services, and then that being turned into lots of good things that we value and that improve our well-being. Why put money values on that? Well, because all of these things are interconnected, whenever you increase your production of one thing, you typically reduce your production of something else. So, for example, if you use land for growing more food rather than timber, then you obviously reduce the number of trees, you might increase the amount of water pollution, you might increase the amount of greenhouse gases being produced, you might reduce the number of wild species and the availability of recreation. So what you can see, the environment is all interconnected. One thing goes up, lots of other things either go up or down. You can't avoid that. The problem is they come in a whole myriad of different units. So food comes in tons, maybe we can turn that into money value quite easily. But then we've got to think about the changes in water pollution, the amount of greenhouse gases that are coming out, the changes to visits, the number of species that are affected. These all occur in lots and lots of different natural units. Now, suppose you were making the decision. What would you attempt to do when you can see all these different things going up and down? Well, you would attempt to try and make them commensurate, to actually work out which ones are more important than other ones. In other words, which ones are more valuable. It's very, very difficult to do that when they're in all these different units. So instead, we try and put them into common units. So instead of comparing tons of CO2 with milligrams per litre of pollution with the number of visits, we try and move those all into a common unit. It wouldn't really matter what unit that was as long as it was generally accepted. Money provides a common unit. It's a particularly useful common unit because money is how decision makers assess all the other things they've got to spend resources on. So it's not just the environment they've got to make decisions about, it's things like education, health, transport, employment, all those other things. And these other things are typically measured in money. And that means that if you want the environment measured in a whole myriad of other units, what you're doing is saying, right, everything else is measured in money, but this stuff is measured in 50 different units. Unfortunately, the consequence of that is decision makers don't know how much money they ought to allocate to the environment. How many hospitals should we not build to improve the environment? That's the real question that policymakers actually have to answer. If you provide them with this whole lot of different units, they can't tell. and they'll probably carry on allocating the same small amount of money that was given in the past. If instead you can show just how vital and important and of course valuable the environment is, then they can make an informed trade-off and actually allocate the amounts of money that the environment and all its benefits are actually due. So how do we measure the economic value of ecosystem services? Well, there's been a huge amount of research over the past 3 or 4 decades looking at the development of methods to provide these values. And we can value many, if not all, of the ecosystem services that nature provides. So, many of these approaches, of course, you'll be very familiar with. So, things like food, timber, there's markets out there providing these goods and they have prices, and so we can come up with values. But what about all the non-market benefits that the environment provides? Well, we have techniques to value those as well. So for example, water quality, we can actually look at the impacts that changes in water quality produce and work out what the change in value induced by those impacts actually is. Flooding, again, pretty simple. We can actually look at the impact of flooding and measure that in money terms as well. What about something a bit more adventurous like climate change? Well, we can again look at the impacts that climate change will have upon economic goods such as food, such as protection from flooding. But we can also look at the costs of reducing climate change through reductions in greenhouse gases. Other things, recreation. How on earth do you put an economic value on being in a location like this? Well, we can actually look at the time and money that people spend to actually go to different locations. And by amassing sufficient data, we can see that people spend more time and more money to go to places that they enjoy, as opposed to places that really don't offer the benefits that they really desire. So again, we can see trade-offs between money and the benefits that, that the environment provides. We can even value things like peace and quiet. We can look at the additional amount that people are prepared to pay to live in locations which have lower levels of noise, and therefore work out their value for that peace and quiet, and also of course the losses that people endure when they lose that peace and quiet and they're exposed to higher levels of noise. How about biodiversity? This is perhaps the most difficult area. There are some aspects of biodiversity that we can value quite robustly. So providing that ecologists can tell us about the relationship between populations of pollinators and the impact upon, say, crops, it's actually fairly simple to then work out the economic value associated with that. We can even see how biodiversity can affect people's behaviour in terms of recreation and see the extra value that's generated there. But what about the value of the continued existence of species? This is a problem because there's no obvious behaviour to look at and use as a basis for valuation. Some economists would suggest that you can ask people questions about how much the people are willing to pay for improved sustainability of species. Personally, I think there's some problems with that. I think people find these questions extremely difficult to answer. So we adopt a different approach. We value all of the other effects of environmental change, but with regard to what we call the non-use value of biodiversity, the pure value of continued existence, we look at imposing upon any new investment an objective that biodiversity either doesn't decline or actually increases. And so you make sure that none of those investments actually impinge negatively upon biodiversity. By doing that, you actually obviate the need to come up with a money value for that, but you do need to value all the other things. Arguably, you can look at the costs of imposing these targets, but again, that should not be taken as the value of biodiversity. We prefer this simpler approach, imposing objectives, making sure that investments don't harm biodiversity, but valuing everything else so that we can show decision makers just how important the benefits of environmental improvement are. So the LEAP Institute and the University of Exeter more widely is internationally recognised as a leader in the field of environmental science and environmental economics. We specialise in the valuation of ecosystem services and the well-being that they generate for society. We also work very closely with policymakers and have actually developed a number of policy support tools that help these decision makers bring the environment into their own decision making. We have developed a lot of the valuation techniques ourselves, but we also are interested in the distribution of these values across society. So we're keen to answer the question about who gets what and to what extent we might want to shift policy and redesign it to actually benefit those more disadvantaged groups in society.